As David mentioned, I'm the editor and CEO of almonitor.com, and we're a media news organization that deals with the Middle East and in the Middle East. We have two really interesting panelists here today. Directly to my right is a Commodore, retired, Abdulateef Al-Mulhim. He is columnist for Arab News and Yaum, and he's a retired Commodore in the Saudi Royal Navy. Welcome. And we have Steve Clemons, and Steve is editor-at-large at The Atlantic and senior fellow for the New America Foundation. And let me just say, we were given some questions in framing our opening remarks, and we're going to be brief in our opening presentation and begin a conversation and then take some of your questions via cards. And some of the questions that we were asked to address were the following. How, regarding the Arab world as a whole, do American policy decisions affect U.S. media perceptions, and/or do media perceptions affect policy decisions? How have such negative perceptions curtailed what might have been or prominent policymaking input and comment by Arab Americans and Muslim Americans? And how, with such examples as post-Mubarak Egypt, pre-invasion Iraq, Hamas's electoral victories in Palestine, periodic arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and/or pictures of children victims of Syria's civil war, can the cultural misunderstandings between Americans, Arabs, and Muslims be decreased, and particularly within major parts of government interactions? So those are just some of the framing questions. I've asked our panelists to speak for 10 minutes or less to start, and we will begin with Commodore Abdulateef, please.
Can you start?
Steve, do you want to go first?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
The question of want and wanting to go first, and it is, first of all, it's great to be with all of you this afternoon. I know we're at the tail end of a long conference, and it's a pleasure. You know, I'm sensitive to the fact that this is a panel on Arab media, and so I decided that my opening admission today, I don't know if any of you have been following the controversy over national security wonk. This is a big thing. This is a undercover guy that's been tweeting. Many of us know him in real life, but I'm one of the people who have been engaging him both positively and in awful ways over the years over Twitter. So I was going to finally admit that I've been living a double life too as an Arab journalist. And you probably haven't seen my name out there, but I'm out there. So I just wanted to try to grasp some legitimacy for being up here today. In any case, I thought we're going to have time for discussion and going through things on whether perception drives policy, or media can drive policy, or policy driving media. And I look forward to that discussion. But I thought I would give a broader and maybe a slightly deeper take on what I think is driving some of the things we heard from people like Prince Turki yesterday, and really gripping the region. I feel like to talk about whether media is driving results or policy is driving the media, in a way is shallower a discussion if you look at the question of whether there's something truly tectonically different that's occurring in the Arab region today, and in terms of the U.S. interaction and place with the world. These are much deeper questions. And so while you might try and fake it, you know, I think the White House and the Pentagon and the State Department are out all the time looking for good tweets, good articles in Al-Monitor or The Atlantic, but they don't matter in the end when it comes down to the deeper structural shifts. Like my colleagues on the panel, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East as an amateur, as somebody who comes along, you know, talking to people on the streets, cab drivers, you know, folks in the hotels, restaurants, whatever. And it is interesting to me to see how widespread the sense of American decline and American disengagement is. And what that means to many people in the Arab world creates a great deal of diversity. So I'm reticent about talking about the Arab media in any sense as a monolithic arena, because there's such a massive change. Perhaps it used to be more monolithic today. But when people are beginning, I think, en masse to look at the fact that the relationship that they had with the West, including Europe and the United States, is fundamentally shifting Some are trying to grasp and hold that old relationship in place, partly because it's what they've known and because their interests are benefited by that. Others are anxious and excited to see the decline of the former colonial powers that have engaged in patterns of humiliation and with the region as some see it. And others are waiting to just see what comes next. And as many people know, conspiracy theories often run rife through the region. They also run rife in other parts of the world as well, but they certainly do in the Middle East. And so there's quite a bit of diverse views and thinking. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. In any case, I see them seeing the tethers of American engagement in the region slipping, the plates in a tectonic sense shifting and moving. We can go back in American history and look at the shift from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, to look at another time when you had relationships shift in substantial ways and people trying to hold on to what once was, being uncertain about what was coming next, and filling the void with lots of conspiracy theories about what might be in there. And there are other historical examples, too, that we could discuss. But in this changing, you know, at least in the perception, if not the reality, I happen to believe that there's some truth to the perceptions in the Middle East. There are new winners and losers, and that the age of predictability of U.S. engagement in the region is largely over and done. We have now an ad hoc engagement. We have coalitions of the willing. We have coalitions of the unwilling lately, particularly in Syria. And, you know, to a certain degree, I think that in that maelstrom of uncertainty, you're going to get quite a lot of perspective. And so the Arab media scene, as I read it and try and read it regularly, is rather rich. With lots of different perspectives. And frankly, there's more debate going on inside the Arab world among Arabs about their future than I've seen before because of the changes in difference, whether that's over Syria. Now, there may be tribal lines that still draw a lot of this, but even if you look within the camps, whether it's Sunni, Shia, and more deeply and specifically tribal, there still seemed to me a great deal of diversity of perspective. I look at that in the long run as healthy. In the short run, it looks chaotic. You know, I think also if you were to go into Europe, I wrote a piece about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, where I said if you want to look and measure American decline in the world, it's very hard to do it because if you listen to presidential candidates, no politicians, no one can ever talk about these kinds of issues very openly and candidly. But if you looked at our relationships with 4 allies, and I outlined Saudi Arabia and Israel, and Japan and Germany. I picked the 4 countries for specific reasons. Japan and Germany were satellites of American interests within their region, both largely destroyed and beaten by the United States in World War II. Very successful nation-building efforts set them back up, and they largely carried our water in policy issues for a long time. So they were vital. You would expect that the tethers that controlled them to be in place for a very long time. And in my book, at the time I wrote the piece, you could look at the very different behavior of Japan and Germany as a measure of the void they felt about how much the United States was driving things. So, in other words, what you may have heard from Prince Turki or may have heard about Prince Bandar's comments about Syria recently is not new. It's been in the making for quite a while, of the perception in Saudi Arabia that the U.S. is not going to be engaged in issues that it cares about in the same way. And not only is it not engaged, America has often stumbled and done things that, from the Saudi perspective and GCC perspective, are deleterious to their interests. So it's a different measure. On Israel, Israel and Saudi Arabia, I said both of their behaviors have changed dramatically, and Japan and Germany each were taking steps that they would not have traditionally done with the perception of less engagement from the United States. So we can jump into that. I think the United States, there was a great article in the Middle East Press, is itself struggling with the question of whether it's a status quo superpower or a revisionist power out to change everything. And if you listen to Barack Obama, he's on both sides of the fence. You know, he's either a sloppy realist or he's an idealist without conviction. And it's very hard in that mix to see where we are. So we're in a place where U.S. foreign policy is constantly, in a way, hedging its bets, because it doesn't want to be too profoundly committed to either direction. We can jump into that. I think that uncertainty about which way we should move is perceived in a lot of ways in the Arab media as either weakness, indifference, arrogance, neglect, or just naivete. I mean, I think that all of those run strong through the region. I think that when you look at the U.S. administration today and measure it back to the expectations of President Obama after the Bush administration, in my book, I believe the George W. Bush administration sped up something that probably would have happened anyway. They sped up global and American history to assure that the predominant role that the United States played in almost all things global would come to an end faster, that the mystique of American power would be punctured. And what do I mean by that? Superpowers in the world engage the world in really 4 different arenas: militarily, economically, morally, and through institutions. And militarily, the United States showed itself to be quite overextended, and thus allies, forget enemies, but allies in that scenario will count on the United States less than they otherwise would. Economically, which was really always the fundamental secret sauce of American influence in the world, with the subprime crisis that became a global financial crisis, we really undid a great deal of our own mystique. Morally, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, things that were seen in Bagram prisons, warrantless spying on American citizens, all of these things threw into doubt. I don't know how many of you remember the Cold War, but all of those would have been impossible to conceive happening when you had a Soviet Union in place that we would point to and say, that's what they do, that we had to be the beacon on the hill that would look quite differently. And so I think the compelling notion of democracy, human rights, respect for habeas, people's rights and habeas corpus, et cetera, moved into a grayer area. I'm not I'm not a person that takes pride in talking about these things, but I don't deny them either, that this really affected those trying to secure democratic movements around the world. And then we got into a kind of interesting problem in the Arab world with the Arab Spring. And I think this has driven a lot of the media frustration with America and the media coverage in the Arab world. Is America on the side of those people trying to pursue justice, liberty, economic rights, women's rights, their tribal rights, whatever it may be, whatever form of justice may be, in throwing off totalitarian or dictatorship arrangements that have been in place for decades? Is America on the side of those, or is America a status quo power that's really trying to keep in place allies that have stand with it? I think that is the 900-pound question, which President Obama has properly resisted answering, because any clear answer to that, other than the fact that we have to wander through this mess in an ad hoc way, would be, one, something that would be quite, I hear somebody, maybe that's my time to end. I will get right to it. I think that this is the biggest issue, because when you looked at Libya and the intervention in Libya and drawing together allies to come in, I was one that thought that the United States would have a hard time not having this become a large slippery slope into a much bigger footprint of involvement in the region, because it's not, we don't have many experiences where that hasn't happened. I was pleasantly surprised that the Western intervention in Libya remained rather small. But the nightmare side of Libya has turned out to be true, that the negotiation and fighting over who the real heroes of the revolution are inside Libya, and this notion that you were going to get some Betty Crocker version of democracy to pop up, were both naive, that these kinds of struggles inside countries are going to go on for a very, very long time. But nonetheless, the Libya intervention created an appetite in opposition groups throughout the region that if they just crossed the right red line, if they just got the right advocates, if they just got the right news media hits, or the New York Times op-ed, or the photos that went viral, that somehow this would trigger American military and European military. Maybe somebody can help the phone. Just throw it on the ground. And in any case, I'm joking. I think that this question of the quality of opposition is a vital one. It's a really important one, neglected, I think, in our discussion because people are afraid of offending or saying something politically incorrect about opposition groups who have very legitimate claims to try and change it. But the notion that that ought to be a burden that the United States or the West takes on for itself is something that I think should be debated. And here in the United States, I find in my own camp in this discussion, I find myself very conservative on that. I find the notion that we would easily lend U.S. forces, U.S. troops, U.S. money, and the very small stock of power that the United States has in the world today behind these things is something I wouldn't be very comfortable with, that there are other elements of statecraft, cultural outreach, diplomatic outreach, and institutions that will generate more secure transitions than we have today. And finally, I would simply say that this tension between idealistic exchanges and the idealism of groups and the expectation to combine, I think everyone should have the right to revolution, even in this country, but with the NSA and others kind of listening in, I'm not a big fan of that. But I do think that the responsibility of these transitions need to lie largely within countries and not without them. And I think much of the Arab media today, which is inflamed over Syria, inflamed that why is the world not doing more, why is the world not helping the opposition take place, is translating this into a notion that Arab or Muslim lives mean less to the United States, to Americans, to people in Europe, than other interventions in which we've engaged in. And I find that to be disturbing, but I believe it is the perception of many Arabs. But I have to tell them, I said, I certainly don't have that impression, but I don't want to line up on the side of a fractious Syrian opposition either. And we can discuss that and what that means. But I think all of these things, because of the lack of clarity of U.S. strategy and U.S. decisions, and the lack of confidence in the United States about saying no and why we say no to certain things, has created and bred an alarming degree of negative criticism and negative perception of the U.S. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. Commodore, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, when I was invited to be in the conference, I asked Mr. Pat Mancino how many hours I'm going to be talking. He said about 7 minutes. I said, Pat, I'm flying 14 hours from Saudi Arabia, 14 hours back to Saudi Arabia for 7 minutes. Then I started debating, does it really worth coming over here? But frankly, after meeting everybody and listening to the speakers, it's the best investment I ever made. And there is a little message to Dr. John Duke Anthony. I wish I met you 20 years ago. Things would have been different. I don't mind giving short speeches because we all know what happened to people who give lengthy speeches. I don't want to give examples. But before I came to Saudi Arabia, I told my wife that I'll be in this conference, and she said, don't push your regular Arab-U.S. red lines. And this is the reason she sent my daughter to watch over me and make sure I don't do it. Being the last speaker, this is why I said you go first. Being the last speaker, I saw a lot of smiley faces. I wasn't sure, are they happy to see me or are they just happy, okay, this is the last thing in this conference. But again, the last speaker, I went from these notes to these notes because they practically said 90% of what I plan to say. So I'll talk about a media person, not a retired Saudi Navy Commodore or a politician or a businessman. So I had gauged some of the questions that I've been asked in the outside, because in the media there is nothing, I will ask you a question off the record. There is nothing, not such a thing. The first question was about the Saudi pullout from the United Nations Security Council. This was my article, or this is my article for today in the Arab News. And to me personally, I think A lot of countries are unhappy with the United Nations, but this is normal. It's not something they are doing wrong or not doing right. The United States pulled out from the UNESCO, and the United States Congress refused to pay their dues at certain times in the United Nations. And they looked at it, even this wasn't a long time ago, but fine, it's a decision. And I think the Saudi decision is taken out of proportion. Saudi Arabia is pulling out from a position that is going to be only for 2 years. But at the end of the day, I was very, very happy. I said, Saudi Arabia, you are very important. Everybody is talking about you. So I'm really, really respecting the decision of the Saudi leadership. The other thing is that I took as a media man is the Arab media didn't take the chances in the American market. The Saudi market for media is open to everybody. Yesterday, we heard one of the speakers who lashed at the United States for half an hour in his 10 minutes speech. How often would you find a country that, you come to their capital and you lash at them and they would laugh? So the American media market is something that the Arabs didn't really take advantage of. We are always media shy. Even Arab officials, they're always shy to talk to the media. So what if I made a mistake? I will correct it. And if there is a meeting, if there is a conference, this guy is the president or that guy is a representative president, why don't I go there? Why don't I talk to the other side? Why does he know more about me than I know about him? So it is better to face the problem rather than simply to hide. There are a lot of opportunities that the Arab media simply missed. Even in Saudi Arabia, I wrote an article. We need a think tank for the gas and oil industry. Everybody is looking at the Gulf states for the oil production, but we get our intelligence reports and production reports from the outside. Why couldn't it be from the Saudi media? So it is very, very important for us to be more open, because the whole skies are open with the new information technology. One of the other questions that people always ask about is the perception of the U.S. role in the region. I also wrote an article about it, and frank article. It said, America, damned if you do, damned if you don't. When the Americans don't talk, we want them to talk, and when they talk, we say, why did they talk? So we have to recognize the role, the role of the United States, but we have to put in our mind that the United States do have their own interest. And one of the American presidents in the past said, way before I was born, American business is business itself. So this is how most people perceive the United States. The other thing that the people ask are, how was the U.S. Syria being covered? To be really frank, also the minute the Arab Spring started in Syria, I wrote an article, Syria, where are the Americans? Because I knew they will ask about the Americans. But we have to be realistic. Since 1945, when Syria gained its independence from France, there was no relations between the United States and Syria. There was never a strategic relation between the United States and Syria. And Syria is different from Libya. Libya was easier to interfere with. Libya was two countries just before 1955, Benghazi and Tripoli. 1,200 kilometers separating these countries. So the minute the revolution started in Libya, it was divided. And it was easy to solve the problem. But with Syria, the Al-Ba'ath was concentrated in more than one area, and it was very, very hard to actually assess it. And believe it or not, even if the United States interfered in the Syrian business, but what would happen if things go wrong? And in Syria, the worst is not over yet. The other thing is the possible thaw in U.S.-Iran relation. Again, I also wrote an article about Iran. It says Iran can live without creating an enemy. And having the United States being closer to Iran, we have to look at what does the United States want from the Iranians. Iran is a very rich country and has a lot of people who are having a lot of money. And believe it or not, they want American products. And can you imagine the Iranian market opening for US companies? Maybe I will not like it to see it open, but a lot of companies want to see it open. And in the Gulf states, we have to adapt to the changes in relation between the United States and Iran. We have to adapt because shifting of powers do change. And things are changing by the day these days. Also, one more thing, U.S. role in the latest Israeli-Palestinian talks. I have always said it, and one of the articles I have written was translated to 12 languages and was republished in every site and paper that I can think of, from Sydney, Australia to Vancouver. And after writing the article, I saw my name in one of the new books of Thomas Friedman in 2 pages covering my name and my articles, not because of me, but because when I talked about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I said it straightforward. The Palestinian refugee issue has to be solved. Otherwise, there is no way the problem is going to be solved. It's not the settlements or anything, because anything could be solved except the lives of people. And when we come to the Palestinian refugee issue, people are asking outside that area, how long are we going to support the Palestinian refugees? And things can change even in the United States, because there are serious discussions in the United Nations about who is going to be considered a Palestinian refugees. Right now, there are pressure to have only the 1948 refugees, but 1967 or any other refugees will not be considered a refugee. And this is technically putting people outside in the street in one single day. And the number of refugees in the Palestinian camps is increasing every single year. So it's that the Palestinian issue has to be solved before actually doing anything about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Nowadays, also people asking me about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia right now, or the media in Saudi Arabia. When I retired from the Navy, I was asked to be a columnist in the Al-Yaum newspaper, which is in Arabic, and the Arab News, which is in English. Because when I was in high school, when I was 16, 17 years old, I used to write little articles in Arabic, so they wanted me to be back the minute I retired. And believe it or not, I asked the two editors-in-chief, do I have red lines? And I was hoping they would say yes, because it would limit myself to write about sports or politics or social issues. They told me, you don't have any red lines. And I was under pressure, but at the same time happy. But we, as columnists in Saudi Arabia, we make our own red lines. And I have pushed the bar a little bit, and I never had an article that is being rejected from publication. I'm still okay?
No.
Okay. So things in Saudi Arabia, because or actually 2 years ago, custodian of the two holy mosques, King Abdullah, actually encouraged the editors-in-chief to actually give the columnists more rooms to write. And right now, it is very hard to hide anything. With the social media, with the internet, with the WhatsApp, it's very hard. As a matter of fact, just a few weeks ago, during the Saudi national holiday, a group of elementary students sent Twitter messages to the highest leadership in Saudi Arabia, because the weekend is a Friday and a Saturday. So they will be coming to school on Sunday, then they will be off on Monday. So these small kids sent these tweet messages to as I said, to the highest Saudi leadership, and they get what they want. Not only in the elementary schools, all government establishments, all universities were given the 1-day holiday, which is Sunday. So they had Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday because of a direct request. Also, there was a very, very useful use for the Twitter in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia right now has the highest usage of mobile phone and social media in the whole world. A couple of divorced and widows in Saudi Arabia sent a message to the king 2 years ago. They said, because of our social status, it's very hard for us to own homes. 1 month later, King Abdullah allocated 250 billion riyals, which is about $60 billion, to allocate lands and build homes for the needy. So this is how open the communication in Saudi Arabia. And there is one thing that a lot of people in the West know or don't know, which is the relation between the ruler and the ruled. And just this afternoon, I had very, very nice little example. Just before, like a couple of hours ago, I went to His Royal Highness Prince Abdulateef bin Talal, and he has very, very important engagement. I said, listen, my speech is going to be the last. I know it's going to be the last, and I know you are having engagement. He said, what do you request? I said, I request your presence. He canceled everything, and he is right here. Believe it or not, I never met him, and I don't even know who he was before today. So this is the kind of communication, and this is what we call in Saudi Arabia the majlis. I'm not a businessman. I'm not from the rich elite. Yes, I am from the middle class, but I met King Abdullah on 3 occasions. I met Prince Salman more than on 1 occasion. The doors of Saudi Arabia in communication between the ruler and the ruled are open. So this is what is the things that some people in the West really don't understand in Saudi Arabia. Even the connection between Twitter in Washington and Twitter in Saudi Arabia. When about just a couple of days before I came over, there was heated debates about the health plan in the United States. All of a sudden, in Saudi Arabia, there are heated debates about improving the Saudi healthcare system, which is free. And if there is no cure in the kingdom, you'll be taking to an outside hospital, the best hospital centers in the whole world. So one of my cousins, who is like 12 years old, he said something about healthcare, and I said, wait a minute, come here. Let me smell your mouth. Have you been to the American Tea Party? I could smell tea in your mouth. So right now, the whole world is connected. You can't hide from it. So as I promised, I'll not make a lengthy speech. I think I'm all done.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me these were 2 rich presentations, and I took some notes. And let me just pick up on one thing the Commodore said, and it's kind of a personal aside. You said if you met John Anthony 20 years ago.
I wish I did.
And I recall 21 years ago, John, I don't know if you remember this, I was a student at the Arabic Teaching Institute for Foreigners in Damascus, studying Arabic. And they took us on a field trip to Quneitra, and we did the tour, and we're sitting out there having lunch, and I'm looking off into the distance, and I see John Duke Anthony also touring Quneitra with people. And I said, hey, this is John. And so we went up and we had dinner, and it was really nice, and it was a great scene. And I told some friends it was so cool to see John Duke Anthony at Quneitra in Syria and go out to dinner with him in Damascus. And they said, oh, yeah. And everyone had a story about running into John somewhere in the Middle East. And they said that's often where you could see him. and it's a testimony to his commitment to the region that's how he's known. And I tell young people, and it makes me think of this as someone who's been a student of the region for so many years and have some responsibility now for a media site that deals with it. I say there are two things you can do. Go there and learn the language. That's where you start. Now, I was never fluent, and I regret that. I was proficient. I could do interviews and stuff, but I tried, and I learned a lot just by engaging and trying. Our speakers mentioned, both of you said one thing is fascinating, and now I get to media, tectonic shifts, and we need to adapt. And there's so much going on, and there's so much media. You think back when I was in graduate school, you'd have to go to the library and look on the shelf to see if the Arabic newspapers had come in, and they'd be a few days late. Now you go online, you can have access to incredible amounts of information. But how are we assimilating this information? How's it getting there with this great access, this great speed, and then these tectonic shifts? And I don't know sometimes if, as an American, I'm speaking as an American now, we hold ourselves or the media accountable for accuracy and what's happening. And my experience, comes back to my point, is the only way you understand this region or any region is you got to listen to the people there in their own voices, in their places. There's really no other way. You imagine someone talking, saying they're expert on the United States who doesn't speak English and never comes here? I mean, we have opinion masking as expertise, and we let that go. Why shouldn't our media be able to nail these tectonic shifts and trends? We should. We should. Now, and I'll monitor, and what I tell you is why I believe this, and this is kind of our ethos, and when we started, was to get to what we call the pulse of the region in its own voice, which is why initially we set up massive translation capabilities. So someone tells me they're a good writer, they write in Arabic, no problem. No problem. Goes up in Arabic, goes up in English, or Hebrew, or Persian, or Turkish, you got it, in both language, because that's the way you understand the region, is by listening to them there. That's all. And then by that, by diversity and by these voices and by commitments to good journalism and reporting, you can get these trends. And I was at a think tank before this, and it's so easy. Maybe it's the internet. People have an opinion and it disappears and no one remembers. Guess what? I remember. I hold myself accountable. I hold my journalists accountable. If they're missing it, they shouldn't be on the payroll. I'm sorry, because they're wrong. That doesn't help. That doesn't help understanding, doesn't help policy if we're playing a role. Did we, in that Al-Monitor, we tried to see these trends, and we have the record, and I look at the record, the U.S.-Russia role and the management of conflict. This is a huge development in the region, what's happened in Syria, and the implications of that. The thaw in Iranian relations. I mean, I think we were one of the few places that picked up in April, we wrote about how Salahi, the Iranian foreign minister, referred to a shared interest. He talked about chemical weapons. He didn't say shared interest, as a red line. He used President Obama's term. That's April. He talked about that. And that had something to do with where we are. The collapse of order in the Sinai. If you went back in our record, this is a big deal in Egypt, and the bigger deal. We've been covering this for a long time. The pressure on Erdogan in Turkey. Now look at what's happening on the border in Turkey, the engagement of Turkish forces with the IISS. Who's watching that? I mean, I'm no Turkey expert. What do I know? I go there a few times. I've engaged with it in the region. Why? Because I got some of the best Turkish journalists writing for me every day. And when Gezi Park took place, I'm not saying they predicted Gezi Park, but boy, did I know the issues that drove Gezi Park. Not because I'm so smart, but because I got smart people writing for me, and they're accountable for what they say. And the issue we get into the Middle East, we haven't really mentioned it much, is the freedom of the press and the issues there. We, in fact, cover that, and sometimes we become part of that in the region because we try to maintain, we are independent, and we try to encourage diversity and accuracy. But the key thing is, in journalism and media, we as consumers of it should make ourselves accountable. It's not okay just to say this and then it's wrong. It matters. Reporting matters, journalism matters, and it's craft. It's not just, hey, what's on my mind today? It's craft. You guys who are journalists, you know that. It's a craft. It's something you learn, it's something you master. Just because you have an idea and you sit in front of a computer screen does not make you a journalist and does not make you an expert. So anyway, I just wanted to ruminate there for a few minutes at the end of the day and picking up on some of the nice themes here that were brought out. We have a question. We're open for more. We've got a few minutes left. Do you see a thaw, I think this is for you, Commodore, in Saudi-Israeli relations caused by their mutual disappointment of the recent U.S.-Iranian diplomacy?
Well, it is very, very hard to gauge a relation between two countries that never had a relation in the past. But no matter what you do, each happening in a country will reflect the other, whether you like it or not. For example, when the atrocities increased in Syria, we heard about Syrians going to the Israeli borders for treatment. But as for Saudi Arabia, it really never, it doesn't have a direct borders with Israel. And as I said, we never had any relation with them. But what does the future months would show in how close the Iranian-American relations and how serious the Israelis about their view to Iran, because we get confusing messages. For example, I wrote in the Al-Yaum newspaper, and the title is about Iran and Israel. At the time when President Netanyahu expressed his displeasure about the American-Iranian relations, just one day later, Iran canceled a conference that was titled to be against Zionism, and the conference was canceled. So Iran are showing many signs, the Israelis showing many signs, and we are getting many signs from the United States, and we are still, just waiting. So it's very hard to judge it at this moment.
Let me just add one other fact that the questioner didn't mention, the Arab Peace Initiative. I mean, how is that being played these days in Saudi? It remains a key part of the Saudi program.
Again, I would refer to some of the things I have written on my articles. One of them was titled Delta Airlines and the Saudi Peace Initiative. Sorcerer's website put it the airline diplomacy. And it was during Delta Airlines or Saudi being part of the Sky team. And there was a question about the Israeli passport boarding different flights. And it was put out in the Saudi papers. So Saudi Arabia, at more than once, especially during the time of King Fahd, when we laid the best plans for a peace initiative. And if the peace initiative by Saudi Arabia was implemented in 1982, all the Palestinians who are born in 1982, which would be in their 30s right now, would be actually having a better life. Saudi Arabia, also again, King Abdullah gave many positive hints and many positive plans for peace initiatives. But to be very frank, and again I have said it more than once, it is only the Palestinians and the Israelis who could solve their differences. The Israeli-Palestinian problems was tried in Washington and Cairo and Oslo and Madrid and Morocco and Lebanon and Cairo. It just didn't work. Unless the parties actually sit down together, they will never solve their problems. Not only the Palestinian Israeli issue, even the Arab Spring countries like Egypt or Yemen, it's the people themselves are the only ones who can make their differences disappear. You cannot bring the United States and push a button and all of a sudden Shia are loving Sunnis and Sunnis are loving Shia. It doesn't work that way. This is why it is very hard to ask somebody about the Palestinian-Israeli problem if he's not from Palestine or if he's from Israel. Even age does make a difference, or the status of the Palestinian or the Israeli would make a difference. And a Palestinian without a family wouldn't make a difference for him to live in any kind of environment. But when you have kids and a wife and you are thinking about their future, then your views will be different. I think the only people who could solve the Palestinian-Israel problem are the Israelis and the Palestinians. This is my own opinion. Mm-hmm.
Steve, there was a piece in the New York Times today about kind of the backstory on Syria policy. Take that issue, and you talked a little about it, and you talked from two perspectives. One is, looking ahead, how do you see this playing out for the Obama administration? Does it fade into the background? Does it become all-consuming? How do you see it? And how do you think the region is seeing when they read the article like we saw in the New York Times today about how Syria policy is being made?
Well, thank you. You're a step ahead of me as I'm just off a plane from India and haven't had the enjoyment of reading that article yet, but I'm happy to talk about what I see as the broader back story on the Syria question. Look, we live in an era of a politics of distraction, and we're all focused on Syria right now. I mean, there was one week where I was trying to go away on vacation. It was before Labor Day, so I guess Labor Day was the Syria chemical weapons issue. And before that, we had Egypt, and before that, so it went weekend by weekend by weekend. And I do a lot of commentary on MSNBC and CNN. And so when one of these foreign policy things explode, I'm there literally 3-4 times a day, whether it's in New York, wherever I may be around the world. And so these things go in, feast and famine. You're either on or off, and so you jump around. So I have a very good measure of what the media sees as the top stories. And so there'll be a point at which Syria was there. The Edward Snowden story was an interesting case. I was on every single night for about a month and a half talking about Edward Snowden and the NSA. The White House kept this story alive by taking away his passport. Had they just let him go to Bolivia or let him to go to Brazil, it would have been, become a boutique story and forgotten very quickly. So I think Syria will eventually do it. But from a strategic perspective, the Syria stuff, what I think the unsaid, although it's now becoming increasingly said, and I think one of John Kerry's mistakes, but I think your former boss, Chuck Hagel, largely sees this, is that the U.S. strategy in potentially bombing and punishing and striking Syria over the August 21st chemical weapons use was an interesting case study. And it's very important to look at the posture involved from the president and those people who spoke at the time. It's very different than the earlier criticism of Syria for chemical weapons use, which Chuck Hagel announced. He was the one that announced it on the beaches of the United Arab Emirates. But in that case, they said, we're going to give small arms to the opposition. And thus, the White House made a terrible mistake of conflating the internal dynamics of a civil war inside Syria with the broader major international norm and question of chemical weapons use. The second time they did, and people like me strongly criticized the White House for that, because they were neither going to change the dynamics of the opposition, nor were they really going to credibly respond on anything it was a terrible response the first time around. The second time I was impressed, because the president went out of his way to reverse something that he has now, again, reversed himself on. But he said, this is not about regime change. It is not about Assad leaving office. It's not about knocking down the government. It's about responding on chemical weapons. Now, why would you do that? What John Kerry was not saying at the point, but 10 days after, Susan Rice, Antony Blinken, Marie Harf, and others at the State Department finally came out and began saying, you know, we're trying to change Assad's calculus on Geneva, that when he used those chemical weapons, they were not an act of desperation, they were an act of hubris. He viewed himself cleaning up the opposition and had largely won, for the most part, the civil war inside Syria, or was winning. And so this notion that you were going to bomb to sort of change this, the question was, could you change his calculus? Now, why do we care about him changing his calculus versus, you know, getting him out of the country? Ultimately, what you've begun to see from the administration is an understanding that if that state falls and collapses, Prince Saud in Saudi Arabia has expressed this to me as well, you have a real nightmare in the region, and you will probably have a horrible set of actors come in and take over the state, and a second bloody and nasty civil war take place in which the warm and fuzzy opposition, whom we like to talk to, will probably be annihilated. So in that scenario, what you are trying to do, but nobody wants to say, is keep Assad there without him. Whether he's there or not, but largely keep the Assad state, get it to negotiate a deal with the warm and fuzzy opposition, and they then together take on the more Islamic radical wing of the opposition. And I think that's what they're trying to make Geneva about. And so whether that was successful, not clear. The notion that we would easily sidle up and become part of the calculus that would help the Syrian opposition. I hate even using that term because it's such a diffuse and disparate set of actors in that President Obama always instinctively felt that was the wrong way to go. There were very, very strong voices on his national security team that wanted him to move much more strongly in favor of that, you know, what I don't mean to deride, but I can't help it, the opposition that likes to talk to the West. It's the opposition that's not talking to the West that is actually most pivotal and has the most traction inside Syria. And those were the people that I think would largely in the end be the heroes of the revolution. So it's been complicated, and the complication of it had to do with the discussion of red lines. One, President Obama's statement that Assad had to go, in my view, and it was kind of a stupid thing to say, because it precluded the ability to actually get on a track with the Russians at the time. We knew the Russians were going to square off on us, but he gave the Russians something that made it too easy to square off. That really shut down issues. And I think discussing red lines in situations like this publicly only creates, we've seen with many neoconservative groups and many others, many democracy activists, human rights activists, many of whom I respect their goals. But the tactics are, once they see a line spoken about, then the dynamic is, how can we rush towards it? How can we animate ourselves aspects of that? And a lot of people, and I don't have the evidence, but one of the really interesting things in the cases of the first uses of chemical weapons, I had serious doubt whether the regime was behind those. I knew the regime had lost control of the chemical weapons, so there was an element of culpability with regard to the use of the first rounds of chemical weapons. But it was very possible, in an important scenario, that elements of the Syrian regime may have been co-opted or may have been sympathetic with the opposition and made these available, but didn't have the transfer mechanisms. The 12 or 13 cases. And so where did I go first? I mean, it's very hard to get folks in the intelligence community to be honest, but you go immediately to the signals intelligence. You go immediately, was there shock among the Syrian command staff by the use of those weapons or not? Was there any line of command authority about the use of those weapons? And if you go and you get access to folks that will be oblique, but nonetheless largely honest, they will say that the kinds of evidence that we had for the August 21st side was radically different, profound, and robust compared to anything we had on the earlier cases. So it raised the question of whether the opposition was there. We didn't handle that internally inside our offices very well, and I think that in our, I am one who would worry, apparently more than Prince Bandar, about what happens with lots of weapons that gets into hands of people who want to continue a battle not only inside Syria, but move it around. I talked to the former head of a defense attaché, I don't want to mention, from Saudi Arabia, in a European country, a prominent person. And I said, what's your biggest fear about the future? He says, my biggest fear of the future is that these this instability in the Middle East ends, because all of our fighters will eventually return home, and we won't have anything for them to do. There is a crowd, whether that's real or not. There are these elements that I think are serious. But can I briefly, just very quickly, touch on the question you asked about the?
Yeah, because we're over time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's important and not often discussed, because when Israel comes up in discussion, it's taken too much for granted that the primary driver in the region of instability is either between Israel and the Arab states or between Israel and Iran. And I am one who believes, the more I've gotten into this, that Israel is kind of a fig leaf for other problems. That the real dynamic, and I think the Saudi, Syria strategists see Iran as their principal rival in the region. And I think the Iranians see the Saudis as their principal rival in the region. And Israel is a convenient scapegoat on the side. And so Saudi Arabia, in many, not a full thaw, but an occasional thawing now again that may freeze up, has been thawing for a long time with Israel. Chuck Hagel went over 6 months ago and did a deal with the Saudis, the UAE, and the Israelis, a huge arms sales deal to all three of them, with them all winking and nodding and recognizing that they were all part of this tripartite, separate but together deal. And when you think back to why AIPAC was founded because of a concern over a Saudi AWACS deal. This was no one in the media was looking at this and going, oh my God, look what Chuck Hagel just did. This is a huge step forward in the implicit negotiations and deal-making between the Saudis and the Israelis. And I think one of the Saudis' legitimate frustrations with Netanyahu and the government is I'm sure that there will be many Saudis here that get upset with what I'm going to say, is while everyone is concerned with the plight of Palestinians, great, I am too, it's not an issue of strategic consequence unless it has echo effect beyond those people. And what's happened is the continual failure to achieve a deal between the Israelis and Palestinians. That's why I completely disagree with you in a friendly way on the issue of this being there. Israelis and Palestinians have been allowed to fail for too long because there were no drivers. But the big stakeholders around them are paying higher and higher in costs for their failures. The strategic consequence of failure is becoming larger because what the Saudis want is not to, they've said they essentially hope for a normalization track with Israel if they ever do solve with the Palestinians. Is that because the Palestinians have been aggrieved and run off their land? Yes, in part. But the broader issue is it allows a different kind of security discussion in the region. Something like the ASEAN Regional Forum was in Asia, where you had nations in Asia that were at war with each other, hated each other beyond levels of enmity that you see within the region. And nonetheless, they set up a security structure in Asia that allowed them to begin talking. And if that became something that would allow the Israelis, which are the regional superpower, to be part of an informal and non-binding discussion on security, that would really be a game changer. With Iran, without necessarily confronting. It's a kind of a confrontational strategy with Iran without confrontation. And so I think that's where the Saudis have wanted to go. They've been hinting at it for a long time. So the thaw has been there a long time. So I count myself out of those. When I listen to Obama and Hillary Clinton and others say we can't want peace more than the Israelis and Palestinians, I say BS. We all need it more than they have been able to achieve. Their institutions won't be able to deliver in either case. So external institutions have to be blamed for the deal they'll both have to fundamentally accept because it's in the strategic interest of the region to go there. So I just wanted to finish there.
Good. Well, we've crossed our own red line of 6:30, but we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That was a great panel. I appreciate that. Thank the audience for hanging in with us at the very end.